Inside of Nazi prisons during the Second World War, there were many executions that took place using devices such as the guillotine. The German guillotine, or the Faulbeil as it was known, took the heads of thousands of people who resisted and defied Hitler and his policies. Ordinary people became the victims of execution for nothing more than having different ideas and refusing to conform to the wishes of the Nazi Party. Many of these resistors became known for their bravery, but they were subjected to the People's Court, where virulent Nazi judges would screech and scream at them before they were taken into the execution chamber. The stories of many of these people today remain forgotten, but they deserve to be told. Today we look at the execution of the guillotined female opera singer who lost her life inside of Prague and a prison there. Join us today as we look at her story, and remember as always to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Marianne Golz-Goldlust was born as Maria Belokostolski in Vienna, Austria in January 1895. Her family were Catholic and her mother was Czech and her father Polish. She had a normal upbringing, but then Marianne trained as an opera singer following high school and also as a ballet dancer, and she then became known as Marianne Tolska. She was a popular singer and dancer, and she appeared during the 1920s in many cities including Linz and Stuttgart, working with Austrian composer Nico Dostal. She would sing operas alongside other tenors, and during this time she got married and also divorced. But in 1924 she moved to Berlin, and whilst here she met a Jewish journalist named Hans Goldlust. The pair then married 5 years later in 1929, but Hans, to avoid being persecuted in Germany, tried to escape negative connotations of having a traditional Jewish-sounding name, so he then became known as Hans Golz. When Marianne married him, she became known as Marianne Golz-Goldlust, and then the couple would move to Prague in 1934, and Marianne then became a theatre critic, reviewing the latest shows inside of the city. She had a normal life, however the Second World War would turn her and her husband's life upside down. The Nazis in 1939 invaded Prague, and the occupation here was terrible. Hitler got what he wanted for a long time, and he conquered Czechoslovakia, which would become a key part of his war armaments production. The Wehrmacht marched into Prague on the 15th of March 1939, and Hitler then proclaimed the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The German citizens inside of Prague to begin with saluted and waved swastikas, but many Czechs cried and were angered and left horrified. Germans in the country were automatically citizens of the Third Reich, whilst the Czechs had their own government, but the Nazis took over the ministries of defence, foreign affairs, customs and communication. But it was the Nazis who were in total control, and in response to the Nazi takeover, many Czechs took their own lives rather than live under occupation. Czechs had to have no ID documents and show their family trees. Signs were put up showing which shops were Aryan, and people were trapped and could not leave without a visa. Swastikas hung from buildings, and SS guards patrolled the streets striking fear. There were Hitler Youth parades most weeks, and many people were executed. Executions were carried out on a daily basis to strike fear into the hearts of the Czech population. It was a terrifying time for people living inside the country, and the Nazis' control was ultimate. They controlled what people listened to, and political dissent could result in execution. Czechs took on an active role against the regime, and there was in the country an illegal communist movement. Many Czechs defied on the anniversary of the Independence Day, and they boycotted newspapers and refused to ride trams as stops were announced in German. Also there were demonstrations in town squares, and these turned violent. At one point the German police opened fire and seriously wounded 9 people, and 400 demonstrators were arrested. One man, a medical student, died during this, but further executions occurred, and Reinhard Heydrich was then brought in to control the Czech population, and he became known as a Butcher of Prague for his brutality. But when the Nazis invaded, Marianne's husband Hans was arrested. She managed to get him released, and she helped him escape to England, and she also helped Hans's Jewish mother and sister to escape the country. Marianne should have gone with them, but she then decided to stay in Prague and spent her time here helping persecuted Jews. She started to hold gatherings at her home to find others who wanted to help, and she then met with local resistance leaders to establish networks to smuggle Jews out of Prague and to safety. Marianne then recruited new resistance members also from Austria, and they helped Jews to escape by smuggling them out through the network and moving money across borders. She even housed refugees in her house, and continued to hold meetings and also arranged to smuggle information about the evil inside of Prague to the Czech government in exile, who were based in England. However, Marianne Golz-Goldlust must have known that she was living incredibly dangerously, and if captured she knew she faced execution for her crimes. But on the 29th of November 1942, she and a number of resistance members were arrested by the Gestapo. Their network had been betrayed, and Marianne immediately confessed to the crimes of treason, and she told the Gestapo that she was the only member of the group, and because of this her fellow resistors were actually allowed to leave the prison, and were then freed and saved. Marianne was then held inside of Pankrac Prison, a brutal and barbaric Nazi site, where thousands were held suspected of being members of the resistance. While she was held in captivity, she managed to write a number of letters to her friends and contacts, which were smuggled out of the prison when people brought her food. However, her family tried to go through the courts to have her freed and to have her brought to safety. But many lawyers at the time were fearful of representing her in case they incurred the evil of the Germans and Nazi authorities. Because of this, the best lawyers turned down the job, until Czech lawyer Marianne Golz-Goldlust took on the case, but she could do little to free Marianne. There was an appeal to the special German High Court and to the Reich Minister of Justice. However, in May 1943, Marianne Golz-Goldlust was condemned to death for her involvement in the resistance, and she was sentenced to death. It would be inside of Pankrac Prison's execution chamber that she would lose her life. During the time in which it was used by the Nazis, 1,079 people, including 175 women, were executed there, using the guillotine. The Germans utilised the French device for executions, as it was considered a reliable and quick method of killing. Certain executioners perfected the use of the guillotine, in which someone would be dead within around 10 seconds of which they entered the execution chamber. The chief Nazi executioner of Pankrac Prison was Alois Weiss, and there were 3 rooms used for executions at the prison. On the 8th of October 1943, Marianne was brought into the execution chamber, and quickly her identity was confirmed. She was then strapped to a metal board by the executioner's assistant. Following this, she was then slid under the guillotine blade, and after a few final checks, the executioner released the blade, and with this Marianne Golz-Goldlust was executed. In the year following the end of the war, all of her letters were compiled and were published, and her story was then told in different media, including even in a play. She was considered a woman who was righteous amongst the nations for her work in rescuing Jews during the war. But Marianne Golz was a brave woman who would risk her life every day to save others. By even housing refugees inside of her home, she knew that she would and could have been condemned to death for this. The Nazis saw this sort of behaviour as completely barbaric and terrible, and as treason, and they punished it in the most brutal way possible. Marianne was a member of the resistance, and she helped to save others, and for this she was considered a brilliant humanitarian, who ultimately gave her life to help others, even when she could have escaped and left the country. Her story is one which certainly deserves to be more well known. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.